Well, a very good welcome and a good morning to you. Today I have the pleasure of hosting former President of Tanzania, His Excellency Benjamin Mkapa. Thank you very much, sir, for making time to be with us.
It's a pleasure for me.
So today we want to talk about, of course, your role in various places in the society, in conservation, in conflicts. But let's start with you telling us the role of former heads of state when it comes to conflicts in the region.
Our task is to make ourselves available for any requests that there may be to help in mediation or the facilitation of mediation, and to deploy the experiences we gathered during the time we were in office to the problems that have cropped up since we left office. I suppose the assumption is that we must have accumulated enough experience to be helpful in the search for solutions to these crisis situations.
Yes.
That is essentially what we have to do. And it's a heavy task because once you are out of office, you don't have a very deep knowledge of the goings-on in government or regionally. But pretty soon you get immersed into the problems and you fashion yourself a position in which you can be helpful.
You have been the lead mediator when it comes to the regional conflicts, especially in Burundi. Where are we with that right now?
We're at the start. We are at the start. I started off with consultations with all the major players, both in government and in opposition inside the country as well as in opposition outside the country. We have come to the point where now I think we can say that we have an agenda, the elements of an agenda for discussion, and to see whether we can arrive at a common approach to the crisis and a possible modus vivendi for all the parties concerned, whether they can live together politically, socially, and economically. But that is really the substance of discussions. So far we've been discussing the framework, the scope, the time, the personalities involved, and so on. But I'm hoping that the next time round we will start tackling those elements of a possible dialogue between the parties.
Now, at the ongoing Africa Union Summit right now, there are lots of discussions where Africa say they need to be self-sufficient, yet they say, they're still being misused by other powers, we call the European countries and things like that. Do you feel Africa has reached a point where we can be self-sufficient in everything?
We can't be self-sufficient in everything because more and more the world is one. I know we don't like the idea of globalization, but we are one world. And so the interaction between nations is unavoidable. What is important is to recognize the attributes of one's nationhood and the elements where you require cooperation with neighbors, with your continent, and then globally. Once you do that, you recognize your own interests. You also give way to recognition of the interests of others in this global community, and then you fashion the modalities of cooperation and interaction. So, but ultimately, you must start from where you are, build a sense of nationhood, explain the national interests, persuade or convince your people that these are really truly national interests, without division, without fear, without anger, absolute concurrence or convergence of a national ethic. And once you've done that, then you can help push the nation into recognize similar attributes of neighbors as well as other African countries. And that is the way you lay the foundation for cooperation, for development.
Yes. Very true. But now when we talk about the new Africa, everyone is trying to say we need to embrace the new Africa. In your thoughts, what's the new Africa? And really, what's the way forward for Africa and a conflict-free Africa?
once you know that the starting point is nations, it's an Africa of 50-something nations. And you try to understand what the common interests of those 53 nations are. And then you have to sit together and apportion roles in the promotion of that common interest. It's easy to get along. But one should not rely too much on the efforts of others rather than one's own efforts as a person or as a nation. And also too, one must be prepared to make sacrifices, because it's always a question of give and take. If you are prepared to make sacrifices, then you are prepared to build a relationship for cooperation and development. The best example of this illustration is the fact that during the independence struggle, we educated our population so much to the understanding that their own independence was meaningless unless it was linked up with the independence of other still colonized countries. And we collaborated so well that we were able to liberate the continent from colonialism and apartheid. The challenge now is how you build a similar readiness to make sacrifices in order to achieve greater cooperation and for mutual interest. And I think that is the problem now, that we are looking more inwards than we are looking outwards. And that's the challenge that I think Africa faces just now. You must build a continental perspective, you must build a continental challenge, you must build a continental vision, and then seek the wherewithal nationally, continentally, but also with friends around the world. And that is what Agenda 2063 is about, to build a continent that is prosperous, that is self-driven, that supervises its own capacity, its own ownership of the resources for that, to bring that development about, and respects the culture, history, but above all, that ultimate objective of continental unity.
Your thoughts on the leadership right now in Africa, Mr. President? What are your thoughts when you look at the Africa that we live in and the kind of leaders that we have now?
That's a difficult question to answer. I think what they need to do most is to motivate, to drive, to explain, to educate, to lead their people towards that path of development through our own efforts, self-driven, also to make sacrifices, but also to be wary that the rest of the world has elements of wanting to dominate us and to exploit our resources. As I say, if you look at our history, our people started off being enslaved. So out of our continent came slave labor. And then the second phase was the question of our resources, natural resources, or our sovereignty, first of all, being lost to colonialism. So we were colonized for the purpose of the deployment of our resources for the development of our colonizers. And now we must be worried that although we have gained our independence, the sustenance of those economies of our former colonizers depends very much on the readiness with which we let them acquire our resources freely. And so we must be on the lookout to argue our case, recognizing that they are not angels, or they are not total well-wishers for our own development and prosperity.
That's very true. In your own opinion, when you look at our founding fathers, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, do you think he would be very proud of the new Africa? If he was to come back, and live in this Africa, would he be proud of this Africa?
I think he would be surprised at the tardiness of the process of African integration. It is very slow. I think he would find that it is very, very slow. And I think if you asked him, he would say that there was this great emphasis on the individual nation rather than the regional, and at the expense of the regional interest and our continental interest also. I think he would be a little disappointed that we are moving slowly towards integration.
Let's talk about now your roles, of course, now in the conservation in wildlife and, you know, in HIV. What are you doing for the wildlife to see that our wildlife are protected, that our future for even our children, that they will be able to see the lions that you have enjoyed, the zebras and things like that?
I was asked after I left office to be on the board of the African Wildlife Foundation.
Yeah.
This is a wildlife conservation and protection organization which is completely non-governmental and membership is totally voluntary, and its funding is purely philanthropic by people who have wealth, who like the idea of the environment, the ecological systems, the wildlife preserves and the wildlands, and feel that these are a necessary factor for the sustainability of development and really of the human race. And it is based in Nairobi, but it's an African one. And they have helped quite a number of African countries, as many as they have a presence or projects in about 13 African countries, including Rwanda, including Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. And they are helping the governments there, the ministries of natural resources and tourism, to consolidate the policies of wildlife conservation and wildlands conservation protection, to fight wildlife trafficking, and to moderate the wildlife hunting so that we can preserve this environment. And our task there now is first to mobilize African philanthropists, because there are philanthropists. You know, all kinds of voluntary causes in Africa are being funded by Africans who have done well. So we are trying to mobilize that so that it runs parallel with the philanthropy from Europe, America, and the Far East. That's it. In order to drive the notion that the struggle for the preservation and protection of the wildlands and the wildlife in Africa must be an African concern. That is our task. And I came here because at our last board meeting in May in Washington, D.C., we said, no, we must make more direct contact at where the power base of our countries is, which is the heads of state and government.
Yes.
And when we learned there was a summit here in Kigali, they decided to send me to see if I can raise the sensitivity of this issue to my principals, my present heads of state.
Of course, now your role as a mediator, you know, even in the other boards, especially HIV and women and children, you know, the new Africa, do you feel it will really have space for women and children, especially in leadership positions? We are seeing, even in Europe, we now have women prime ministers, but do you think we will see more women presidents in Africa?
I have no doubt that the profile or the participation of women and youth in the governance of our countries has got to be increased. No question about that. And while I was in office, I tried my best. The legislature increased by statute the number of women legislators. We provided for youth to rise within the political parties. But also I made appointments to high office, ministerial and parastatals of women. But that has to be kept constantly in mind by governments. The youth, yes, we have not only to patronize them, but to enable them. And that is the challenge. You see, I myself was a young man at the time, and I was patronized and enabled by our founding president. And he was my role model, but he took me up and nurtured me in such a way that I was able to rise up the political ladder to the highest office in the land. But there must be a program of mentoring or tutoring youth so that they assume not just the title but the responsibilities of governance, economic, political and social.
A united Africa, Mr. President, do you think we will have a united Africa where we all work together to see the good for Africa and not just try to fight and protect our own pieces of land, and what we have, and natural resources and things like that? A united Africa.
I think it is possible. As you know, the Agenda 2063 sees that happening about 2063. I shall be long, long gone by then. But I have hope that it can be done. I think it can be done. But it wants real dedication and a readiness to sacrifice for the common good.
If you were to push our viewers today who are watching us, you know, for betterment of Africa, what would be your advice to everyone at home who feels maybe they need to relocate and move to America? You know, we have seen the migration process and many people leaving Africa for what they call greener pastures. What would be, you know, your word for them right now?
For the governments, I would say they try to create an environment which enables people to earn their livelihood in their own country. Environment both of peace, environment by legislation, environment access to capital, environment by way of by just laws, and so on. But two, I would ask the youth to really demonstrate a sense of self-reliance. I think this exodus is much more an illusion that if they go abroad, they will be less dependent than they are here on the continent. And that's false. First, there is a very real limit to how many people will be absorbed, as you've noticed in the last few months.
Yes.
Even legislation is being passed to limit the number of immigrants in Europe. And now in America, you have candidates who are asking for limitation of immigration. So the key really lies in our own countries. As the saying goes, we must drop the bucket where we are. And we are fortunate to have a wealth of natural resources, ecosystems that can really sustain our populations. But the enabling environment must be created. That's the responsibility of government. But the attitudinal one is the responsibility of our people, and especially the youth.
Thank you very much, sir, for making time to be with us today.
Thank you.
Well, I was speaking to the former president of Tanzania, President Benjamin Mkapa, who says there is hope for Africa, there is hope for United Africa, and especially for the youth. Do keep it RTV. Thank you very much for being with us.